Now, in this week's edition of Let's Talk Some Star Wars, we'll be taking a look at the results of the poll that asked the question, with less than a week to go until its release, how do you feel about the Rise of Skywalker? I'll also be comparing these results with the ones I got a couple months back to the very same question, to try and see if there's been any sort of change of opinion, and I'll also be reading and responding to some of your comments, as well as showing off some of the artwork that was sent in to me this week. And before I get to those results, let me just say that this is going to be a spoiler-free video, despite the fact that I know pretty much exactly how the movie plays out at this point, and so any response I give to comments will be made as if I don't know how the movie plays out. Because this video is meant to focus on how excited people are or are not for the film, and not meant to be a critique of the film itself. I'm still waiting to see it to make any sort of final judgment. However, if you don't want to run the risk of absolutely anything, even something very small, potentially being spoiled, you may just want to skip this video. Next, let me throw out my usual disclaimer that yes, the results of this poll are likely going to be skewed to some extent. I don't claim they're absolute proof of anything or indicative of how the whole fanbase necessarily feels. Mainly these polls are done in fun, and I just find it an enjoyable way to interact with people who watch my videos, and I do hope you all enjoy them as well, even if I don't happen to respond to your particular comment. All of that said, let's take a look at the results, where we'll see that 34% of the some 64,000 voters said that they fall somewhere in the middle, and are somewhat excited and or somewhat doubtful about this movie. 22% said that they're not all that excited or mostly doubtful, while 25% said not excited at all and have no hope. On the other side of things, we had 11% saying they were mostly excited and or had only a few doubts, while 8% said they were super excited and felt confident it was going to be a great movie. And if we compare that to the same question from roughly 2 months ago, where there were 27,000 less votes, we'll see that we still got almost the exact same results. Now, I think there's a couple things we can maybe take away from this. First, it doesn't seem like there was any dramatic shift in opinion over the past few months. Not that I necessarily expected one, but who knows what could have happened if there had been some type of brilliant marketing campaign launched for the film. Second, and no surprise, it seems as if I've reached a lot more like-minded people in the past 2 months, and that there's probably a lot more like-minded people still out there. Though again, I'm not saying this is how the whole fan base feels, and in the grand scheme of things, 64,000 fans is a drop in the bucket compared to the millions and millions of fans out there. Yet still, 64,000 people is not a tiny number. So I'm going to say that clearly there are a lot of fans not excited for this film, and if we could pull the whole fan base somehow, I think the results would be rather interesting. Not that they'd look exactly like this, or even necessarily close to it, but I think you'd find a lot of fans have lost some degree of faith or interest along the way, more so than some would want to admit. Anyway, let's move on to some comments now, and I might do fewer than usual this week simply because the dam has kind of broke on spoilers, and I'm guessing a lot of you, like me, already know the ins and outs of this movie, but I still want to get to the things some of you had to say going into the release of the film. Also, I'm planning to put up my next poll on Monday morning, and I'll ask those of you who have seen the film what you thought of it, and then next weekend I'll make a video strictly reading fellow fan reviews of the movie, though I will ask to keep them relatively concise, even though I'm guessing some of you may have a lot to say. Finally, since this is going to be a shorter video, though it won't be if I keep rambling, I'm not going to be able to get to all of the artwork sent in this week, so I'm going to randomly pick some and then I'll use the rest next time. Anyway, let's get to this week's top rated comment, which this time came to us from Dark Hub, who said, "I'm not very excited for it, to be honest. I'm not excited for any of the characters. They could have used this trilogy to build up the new generation without disgracing the old heroes, and have the last movie be the final passing of the torch where our old heroes retire and have the new generation that, if done correctly, we would actually care about. But that's not what they did. The Emperor is the only character I'm even remotely excited for, yet that completely negates Anakin's sacrifice, and it doesn't look like Anakin will have a big role, if any at all, in this movie. Additionally, Rey is going to face up against the Emperor, who only a year or so earlier in the canon thought the Jedi were a myth. All the characters I cared about are already dead in canon, with the exception of Lando, but it still seems he's not going to have a huge role. To be completely honest, I want the Emperor to just win at this point. That would be a subversion of expectations I'd welcome." And you know, I constantly hear how Star Wars fans are supposedly the worst, how they're impossible to please, that they don't want something too similar to the old, yet they also complain when they get something too new and different. When really, as this comment basically points out here, what most fans want, or what I think they want, and keep in mind I talk to a lot of fellow fans, is for there to be respect for what came before. That those making new stories treat the stories of old, and especially the characters of old, with the same reverence they have for them. And that's really it. There's not some crazy long list of demands that all fans have that must be met, or there's going to be some type of revolt. A lot of people like to say that Star Wars fans are mad if the story doesn't go exactly how they want it to, when I'd argue all most fans really wanted out of the sequel trilogy was to see one last adventure from the heroes of old, for there to be one scene when they all get back together again, and for Anakin Skywalker to show up at some point and to do something somewhat important to the story. I mean, I obviously can't speak for any fan other than myself, but that was basically my list of things that I wanted from the sequel trilogy, and anything and everything else that may happen, I was open to. I just wanted these few small things that I'd been waiting a lifetime to see. But then you have someone like Rian Johnson who says, and he said it again recently, that you should never give fans what they want, that the best part of the story is when you challenge them and do something unexpected. And he says it as if those two things must be mutually exclusive, as if the MCU doesn't exist, where movies are made for the fans, yet can also very much surprise us. And I know someone might want to counter all this by saying, well, it's boring if you don't do anything interesting with the characters of old. But to them, I'd say, that's kind of what the new characters are for at this point, and do whatever the hell you want with them, and fans won't complain as long as they're handled well in general. I mean, imagine if in The Last Jedi, Luke had been pretty much what we expected him to be, but in the end, Rey goes to the dark side and joins Kylo Ren. Which big twist do you think works better for the story? Grumpy Luke or Dark Side Rey? Alright, let's now move on to this comment from Palpameme, which is a great name by the way, who had this to say. I'll just say this. This is the first movie I've avidly followed and sought out leaks for. Any other film, be it The Last Jedi, Solo, I still had that small voice in the back of my head saying, but do you really want it spoiled? And the answer would be no. Even Solo, which I was not particularly excited for and didn't even go see in the theaters, I still had a little bit of quizzical wonder as it began. I still wanted watching it to be my first experience of it. It says a lot that I have seen all the leaks for The Rise of Skywalker, and I still do not feel anything for this movie. And it's funny what a few years and a few movies can do, because during the lead up to The Force Awakens, if anyone tried to tell me anything even remotely spoiler-like, I'd plug my ears like a child and make loud noises if need be to not hear it. Now if someone's like, hey Thor, did you hear the latest spoiler for The Rise of Skywalker? I'm like, well no, but you know what, just go ahead and tell me. Okay, next up here we have this comment from Unknown who said, if Hayden Christensen shows up as a Force ghost, then I will ignore the immense amounts of problems that The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi had and accept the sequel trilogy as canon. And that's a pretty bold statement to make, but I will say that if Anakin shows up and again does something of some importance in this movie, I'll be a lot more forgiving of this film at the very least, and maybe the whole trilogy. Like I said a moment ago, my list of demands is pretty short. Basically, I just want what happened before in the previous two trilogies to still matter. That's probably the best way to explain what expectations I have that I really feel need to be met. Moving right along, our next comment comes to us from Matthew Dwayne, who said, I feel like there's really no point to this trilogy, honestly. Why are we still here just to suffer? And as I've said before in other videos, the very first thing decided about this trilogy really should have been, what is our story going to be? How will this add to and enhance the overall story or the other two trilogies? How are we going to convince people that there was something more to tell after the way Return of the Jedi ended? How do we take the Skywalker saga to yet another level and justify continuing this story? Instead, I feel like the very first thing they sat down and talked about and decided upon was our new main character needs to be a female. We need to make her the next icon of Star Wars. We need to make her a symbol, which is by no means a bad idea. It's great to finally have a female lead in this franchise, absolutely. But once what you're going to make of her is your priority, once you're more worried about real-world optics for your character than the story, what you'll do with that character will be limited, and you'll likely end up with some two-dimensional representation of a real-world ideal, not a three-dimensional character in the Star Wars universe. Alright, let's now move on to this comment from Ben Austin, who said, I've enjoyed both Star Wars sequel trilogy movies up to this point so far. I definitely have a lot of issues with them, but they've entertained me. But Rise of Skywalker bringing Palpatine back makes me worried, because even though I like him, it risks making it seem like not much was accomplished in the original trilogy. I would much rather explore in this film some of George's original ideas for the sequel trilogy, especially the Wills being parasitic beings feeding off the Force. I hope this movie has some elements from that in it because it would be a shame to not see what George came up with. The Wills seem really fascinating to me. And with midichlorians and the Wills and all of that, I think it goes without saying that not everyone would have loved what George Lucas did with the sequel trilogy, but at least it would have been original. At least it would have likely advanced the story instead of retelling it. And not to dash your hopes here, but J.J. Abrams recently talked about the midichlorians and why they're not mentioned in the sequel trilogy, and that's because he prefers the Force being something more mystical, which, don't get me wrong, I certainly understand and I can respect that opinion, but we all know Lucas was going to take things in a different direction. Problem is with the whole thing is that I think there is a lot of confusion about what the midichlorians even are, with some believing they generate the Force somehow. But in reality, and to keep it very brief here, all they really do is act as a gateway between the living and the cosmic Force. They allow those who are alive, or a part of the living Force, to basically hear the will of the cosmic Force, and in general, that's about it. And though you might say, well, they also act as a power meter, that the more you have, the stronger with the Force you can be, I'd like to think it's kind of the opposite, that the stronger you are with the Force, the more of them you just happen to attract, and that the Sith actually develop a low midichlorian count because, over time, they increasingly defy the will of the Force, and you could almost say become less a part of the living Force, which would explain why they may tend to look withered and haggard over time. Okay, and now on to our final comment, which comes to us from Renee Zyworth, and my apologies if I just pronounced that wrong. Anyway, Renee said, plan to see it on Wednesday, that's when it comes out where I live, but probably going on Thursday because The Mandalorian drops on Wednesday, and I'd rather watch that. And at the time of recording this, I've already watched the new episode of The Mandalorian, and it was fantastic, and I'll have a review for it up probably sometime tomorrow. And no matter how good or bad The Rise of Skywalker turns out to be, I can take solace in the fact that there is new Star Wars out there that I'm really loving and enjoying, and that we may have more to come in the form of the Kenobi series, and even the Cassian series could turn out to be good. And let's also not forget about the Clone Wars Season 7, which is about 2 months away. I mean, yes, it's unfortunate, to put it very mildly, that this is what the sequel trilogy is and has done to the fan base, but maybe, hopefully, this means things will be better in the long run, that they'll truly learn from their mistakes, and the right people will soon be running the show and directing the future of this franchise. Well, that's all I've got for this time. Now it's your turn to tell me how you feel about The Rise of Skywalker that, as we speak, is now starting to release around the world. Or let me know what you thought about what I or anyone else had to say in this video. Either way, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.